Welcome back to Fear Rest. In today's episode, I'm sharing 8 deeply unsettling stories from West Virginia's isolated mountain towns. These are tales of night shift workers who encountered something in the quiet hours that defied explanation. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The gas station sat at the junction where Route 32 splits off toward the state forest, about 15 miles outside of Helvetia. I took the overnight shift, though the summer I turned 23, mostly because nobody else wanted it, and the pay was decent enough to help with my student loans. The place was built sometime in the 70s, all cinder block and fluorescent lighting, with 2 pumps out front that got maybe 5 customers between midnight and 6 a.m. on a good night. My manager's name was Dale, and he'd worked there since the place opened. He told me the first night that I should keep the back door locked no matter what, and that if I heard tapping on the windows after 2 a.m., I shouldn't look. I thought he was just messing with me. Dale had that kind of dry humor where you couldn't tell if he was serious or setting you up for a joke that wouldn't land until 3 weeks later. The station was surrounded by woods on 3 sides, with the road cutting through like a dark river. During the day, you could see hikers sometimes, people heading up to the trails. At night, it was just the insects screaming in the trees and the occasional truck hauling timber through. I'd brought my laptop to watch movies, but the Wi-Fi was terrible, so mostly I just read or restocked the coolers when I got bored. The coffee machine made this grinding sound every 20 minutes that I got used to pretty quickly. Around the end of my second week, I was wiping down the counter around 1:30 in the morning when I heard the tapping. It was rhythmic, 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 more, coming from the window that faced the tree line. I looked up instinctively, even though Dale's words came back to me right then. The fluorescent lights made the windows into mirrors at night, so all I could see was my own reflection and the bright interior of the store behind me. But the tapping continued. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I told myself it was a branch. The wind had picked up around midnight and there were plenty of trees close enough to scrape the building. I went back to wiping the counter, but my hand was shaking just slightly enough that I noticed. The tapping stopped after maybe a minute, and I felt my shoulders relax. Just a branch. Obviously just a branch. The next night it happened again. Same window, same rhythm, same time. 1:30 almost to the minute. This time I didn't look, but I found myself counting the intervals. 3 taps, 4 seconds of silence, 3 taps. It went on for about 2 minutes before stopping. When I went to take the trash out back around 3 a.m., I walked along the side of the building with my phone's flashlight. There weren't any branches near that window. The closest tree was a good 8 feet away, and its limbs didn't extend toward the building at all. I didn't mention it to Dale. I figured he'd either tell me he warned me, or he'd think I was making things up for attention. But I started getting tense around 1:15 each night, waiting for it, and it came every single shift. Same window, same pattern. I tried to ignore it, but there's something about that kind of repetition that gets under your skin. It felt intentional, like someone was trying to establish a routine, waiting for me to get used to it. About 3 weeks in, the pattern changed. The tapping started at the usual time, but it moved. It would tap on the front window for a few seconds, then stop. Then I'd hear it on the side window, then the back door, then the other side window, moving around the building in a slow circle. Always 3 taps, always the same pause, but traveling. I stood behind the counter with my heart doing something weird in my chest, this fluttery, anxious thing, and I watched my reflection in the front window. The tapping completed its circuit and stopped. At 2:15, a customer came in. An older guy in a hunting jacket, smelling like cigarette smoke and motor oil. He bought coffee and a pack of jerky, and while I was ringing him up, he glanced toward the woods and said, "You work here alone all night?" I said yeah, and he just nodded slowly. "That's brave," he said, and left. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but it sat wrong with me the rest of the night. The next shift, the tapping started earlier, 1 a.m. instead of 1:30, and it was faster. Still 3 taps and a pause, but the intervals were shorter, more urgent. It circled the building twice, and on the second rotation I heard something else underneath it. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails on glass. I was gripping the edge of the counter hard enough, but my knuckles went white. The sound stopped at the back door and just stayed there. Tapping and scratching, tapping and scratching. I called Dale. I don't know what I expected him to do at 2 in the morning, but I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing it. He picked up on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep. I explained what was happening, and there was a long pause. Then he said, "Is the back door locked?" I said yes. He said, "Keep it that way, don't open it. I'll be there at 6. He hung up. The tapping at the back door continued for another 10 minutes, and then it just stopped. Silence. I stood there in the middle of the store under the buzzing fluorescent lights, listening so hard my ears hurt. Nothing, just the coffee machine grinding and the hum of the coolers. Around 4 a.m., I needed to restock the cigarettes behind the counter, which meant turning my back to the windows. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, and that's when I saw it. There was a mark on the front window, a handprint. It hadn't been there earlier in the night, I was certain of that. I'd cleaned all the windows at the start of my shift. The print was on the outside of the glass, smudged and dirty, fingers too long and spread too wide. I stared at it, and my mouth went completely dry, like I'd been breathing dust. I didn't go near the window. I stayed behind the counter until a logging truck pulled in just after 5 a.m. The driver was a regular, a guy named Marcus, who always bought 2 energy drinks and a bag of peanuts. He came in and I must have looked rattled because he asked if I was all right. I said I was fine, just tired. He nodded, paid, and left. I watched his truck disappear down the highway, and the isolation settled back over everything like a heavy blanket. Dale showed up at 6, right on time. I told him about the handprint, and we went outside to look. It was still there, smudged and strange, but in the daylight it almost looked like it could have been anything. Dale studied it for a long moment, then looked at the tree line. "You're doing good," he said finally. "Most people don't last a month." I quit 2 days later. I told Dale it was because I got another job, which was true. I picked up shifts at a diner in town, but really I couldn't handle the waiting anymore. That feeling of knowing something was out there, circling, tapping, trying to find a way in. On my last night, I left 20 minutes before my shift ended. I just locked up early and got in my car. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I checked my rearview mirror. There was someone standing at the tree line. Too tall, too still. I didn't slow down to get a better look. I just drove, and I didn't stop until I was back in town with streetlights and people and noise. I still drive past that gas station sometimes during the day, on my way to visit my parents. There's always someone working there, and I wonder if they hear it too. Story 2. My uncle left me his property up near Pickens when he died. I'd only been there twice as a kid, and both times were in summer during the daytime, so my memories were mostly of wildflowers and the smell of pine. The cabin was small, 1 bedroom and a wood stove, sitting on about 40 acres of sloped forest. The lawyer told me the estate taxes weren't bad, but I'd need to either sell it or start paying insurance, and I was between jobs at the time, so I figured I'd drive up and see what kind of shape it was in. Maybe stay a few days, clear my head, decide what to do. I arrived late afternoon in October. The road up to the cabin was barely maintained, more like 2 tire ruts through the brush than an actual driveway. The trees were changing, all rust and gold, and the air had that clean, cold edge to it that made everything feel sharp. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The porch sagged on one side, and the windows were covered in grime, but the roof seemed intact. I parked my car and just stood there for a minute, listening to the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was thick and heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Inside, the cabin smelled like mildew and old wood smoke. My uncle's furniture was still there, a sagging couch and a table with uneven legs. There was a manual typewriter on the table, covered in dust. I didn't remember my uncle being a writer, but maybe he'd taken it up late in life. The bedroom was through a narrow doorway, and the bed frame was still there, though the mattress was long gone, probably taken by mice or rot. I set my sleeping bag on the floor in the main room and got the wood stove going. I'd brought groceries, canned soup and bread and some coffee, enough for 3 or 4 days. The first night passed without incident. I heated up soup, read a book by lantern light, and went to sleep around 10. The forest outside was loud with insects and the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. Normal sounds, I slept fine. The second night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps like someone pacing back and forth. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening. The footsteps would go from one end of the porch to the other, pause, then come back. I told myself it was a deer. They got bold sometimes, and the porch was only a foot off the ground. But the rhythm was too steady, too measured. After about 5 minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, but they didn't start again. In the morning, I went outside to check. There were prints in the dirt near the edge of the porch, but they didn't look like deer tracks. They were smudged, indistinct, almost like someone had dragged their feet. I took a picture with my phone, though I'm not sure why, maybe to prove to myself that I'd seen something real. That day, I explored the property a bit. There was an old tool shed about 100 yards from the cabin, its door hanging off the hinges. Inside were rusted saws and a stack of firewood so old it crumbled when I touched it. Behind the shed, I found a stone cairn, just a pile of rocks stacked about waist-high. It looked deliberate, like a mark of some kind. There was nothing else around it, no grave or sign, just the cairn standing alone in a small clearing. Something about it made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. I left it alone and headed back to the cabin. The second night, the footsteps came earlier, around midnight. Same pacing pattern back and forth across the porch. I got up and went to the window, moving slowly, trying not to make noise. The glass was grimy, but I could see the porch in the moonlight. There was nothing there. The footsteps continued, clear and distinct, but the porch was empty. I stepped away from the window, my heart hammering, and the footsteps stopped immediately, like whatever was making them knew I was watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with the lantern on, listening. Around 4 a.m. I heard a soft knocking on the back door. 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced. Then silence. Then 3 more. I didn't go to check. I just sat there until dawn, and when the sun came up I felt ridiculous. Exhausted and rattled, but ridiculous. I should have left then, but I kept thinking about the property, about the taxes and the decision I needed to make. One more night, I told myself. I'd give it one more night, and then I'd drive back to town and figure things out from there. That evening, I found something in the typewriter. A single piece of paper rolled into the carriage. I hadn't noticed it before because the paper was yellowed and blended in with the dust. I pulled it out carefully. There was a single sentence typed in the middle of the page. Don't go to the cairn after dark. My uncle's handwriting was underneath, shaky and faint. I should have listened. I sat at the table, staring at the paper, my stomach twisting. The sun was setting, and the light coming through the windows was orange and fading fast. I thought about leaving right then, just packing up and driving out, but the road was tricky in the dark, and I didn't trust myself to navigate it in this state. So I locked the doors, got the fire going, and decided to wait it out until morning. The footsteps started at 10 p.m., not on the porch this time. They were walking around the cabin, circling it slowly. I could hear them on the dirt, the soft crunch of footsteps moving clockwise around the building. I stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly to follow the sound. When the footsteps reached the back door, they stopped. A long pause, and then the knocking started. 3 knocks, measured and deliberate. Then nothing. I waited, my breath shallow. The knocking came again, this time on the side wall just above where I knew the bedroom was, then on the front door, then on the window by the couch. It was circling the cabin, knocking as it went, and each time it sounded closer, more insistent. I backed toward the wood stove, the only source of light, and watched the windows. The knocking stopped, and then I heard it. A voice, muffled but clear, coming from outside the back door. It was my uncle's voice, calling my name. I froze. My uncle had been dead for 3 months. The voice called again, patient and calm, saying my name like he was asking me to come help him with something. I felt my legs shaking, and I wanted to respond, wanted to ask what was happening, but I clamped my mouth shut. The voice called one more time, and then it stopped. The rest of the night was silent. I left at first light, didn't even pack properly, just threw everything in my car and drove down the rutted driveway faster than I should have. When I got to the main road, I pulled over and just sat there, shaking. I called a real estate agent that afternoon and listed the property. I sold it for below market value to the first buyer who made an offer. I don't know if they've experienced anything, and I don't want to know. A few weeks later, I went through my uncle's papers that the lawyer had given me. There were some old photos, bills, nothing unusual, but at the bottom of the box, I found a journal. Most of it was mundane, notes about weather and firewood and repairs. But the last entry, dated about a month before he died, just said, "It knows my name now. It sounds just like her." I never found out who her was. Story 3. I worked as a night custodian at the old Randolph County Courthouse for about 8 months. The building was built in the 1890s, all red brick and tall windows, sitting on a hill overlooking the town of Beverly. Most of the offices were only used during the day. and at night it was just me and occasionally a lawyer working late on a case. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m., and my job was to clean the offices, mop the floors, take out the trash. Simple work, and the pay was steady. The building had 3 floors and a basement where they kept old records and maintenance equipment. I usually started on the 3rd floor and worked my way down, which meant I'd be in the basement around 3 or 4 in the morning. The basement was unfinished, concrete floors and exposed pipes, with rows of metal shelving holding boxes of documents that nobody had looked at in decades. There was one light bulb every 20 feet or so, and they barely did anything to cut the darkness. I hated going down there, but it was part of the job. My supervisor was a woman named Karine, and she worked at the courthouse for probably 30 years. She told me during my first week that I shouldn't stay in the basement longer than necessary. When I asked why, she just said the building was old and settled weird at night, made noises that could spook you if you weren't used to it. I didn't think much of it. For the first month, everything was fine, boring even. I'd clean the offices, mop the hallways, and do a quick sweep of the basement before heading back upstairs. The only thing that ever bothered me was how quiet it got. During the day, the courthouse was full of people and phones ringing and footsteps echoing. At night, it was like the building was empty in a way that felt unnatural, like it was waiting for something. Around the start of my 2nd month, I was in the basement organizing some cleaning supplies when I heard a door close upstairs. Not a slam, just the soft click of a door shutting. I figured it was a lawyer working late, so I didn't think anything of it. But then I heard footsteps on the floor above me, walking down the hallway toward the stairwell, slow, even steps. I waited for them to stop, but they didn't. They reached the stairwell and started coming down. I stood there in the basement, listening to the footsteps descend. They were deliberate, unhurried, and they stopped on the landing between the 1st floor and the basement. I waited for whoever it was to call down or come the rest of the way, but they didn't. They just stopped. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps started again, going back up the stairs. I didn't see anyone. It happened again the next night. Same time, around 3:30 a.m. Door closing, footsteps in the hallway, descending the stairs to the landing, then stopping. Silence, then back up. I started timing it, and it was almost exact every night. 3:30, like clockwork. I mentioned it to Karine, and she got this look on her face, sort of resigned. She said the building was old, sounds carried weird, and that I was probably hearing the heating system kicking on. But I knew what I heard. Those were footsteps, not pipes. After about 2 weeks of this, I decided to wait on the 1st floor instead of the basement. I wanted to see who was walking around. So at 3:15, I positioned myself in the hallway near the stairwell, lights off, just waiting. 3:30 came, and I heard the door close on the 3rd floor. The footsteps started coming down the hallway above me. I could track them by the sound, and they were heading for the stairs. They started descending, and I stepped closer to the stairwell, looking up into the darkness. The footsteps reached the landing between the 2nd and 1st floor, and I saw something move in the shadows. A shape, tall and thin, standing just outside the reach of the emergency light. It didn't move like a person. It was too still, too upright, like it was balancing on something. I couldn't see details, just the outline. And then it turned toward me. I felt it looking at me, even though I couldn't see a face. My legs went weak, and I backed away slowly, not making a sound. The shape stood there for what felt like a full minute, and then it turned and walked back up the stairs. I didn't sleep that night. When my shift ended at 7, I went straight to Karine's office and told her I couldn't work in the building anymore. She didn't ask for details. She just nodded and said she'd find someone else for the night shift. I finished out the week, but I stayed on the 1st floor. I didn't go near the stairwell, and I definitely didn't go down to the basement. On my last night, I was mopping the main hallway around 4 a.m. when I heard something dragging across the floor above me. A heavy scraping sound, like furniture being moved. It went from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped. Then it started again, moving back. I stood there with the mop in my hand, staring at the ceiling, and I realized the dragging was following the same path as the footsteps. Same route, same timing. I left the mop and walked out. Didn't finish my shift, didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just got in my car and drove home. A few days later, Karine called and asked if I'd left anything in my locker. I said no. She mentioned, almost casually, that the new custodian had quit after 3 nights. She didn't say why, and I didn't ask. About a month later, I ran into a guy at a bar in Elkins who told me he used to work at the courthouse in the 80s. I mentioned I'd done the night shift for a while, and he got this look, like he understood something without me having to explain. He said they used to be holding cells in the basement, back before they built the county jail. One of the prisoners hanged himself in his cell in 1952. They sealed off that section of the basement afterward, but he said people still heard things down there. I never went back to confirm. I didn't need to. Story 4. My friend Juliana and I used to work the overnight shift at a rural health clinic outside of Marlinton. The clinic was only open during the day, but someone had to be there overnight in case of emergencies, which in that part of West Virginia usually meant logging accidents or someone having a heart attack in the middle of nowhere. Most nights, nothing happened. We'd sit in the break room, drink coffee, and watch old movies on Juliana's laptop. The clinic was small, just a waiting room, 3 exam rooms, and a back office. It sat at the edge of town where the streetlights ended and the forest started. Juliana had been working there longer than me, about 2 years. She was the one who trained me when I started, showed me where the supplies were kept, and how to handle the emergency radio. She mentioned once, almost offhand, that sometimes the motion sensor lights in the hallway would turn on by themselves. She said it was probably mice or the building settling, but she always said it in a way that made me think she didn't quite believe that. The lights started going off during my second week. I'd be sitting in the break room, and I'd see the hallway light up through the doorway. The motion sensors were sensitive, designed to catch movement even in low light, but there was never anything there when I checked. It happened maybe once or twice a night, random times, never consistent. I got used to it pretty quickly. Around the end of my first month, I was restocking the supply closet around 2 a.m. when I heard the front door open. The bell above it chimed, a bright little sound that echoed through the empty clinic. I walked out to the waiting room, expecting to see someone injured or maybe a sheriff's deputy with a prisoner who needed stitches, but the waiting room was empty. The front door was closed. I checked the lock, and it was still engaged. The bell shouldn't have rung if the door didn't open. I went back to the supply closet, but I felt uneasy. I texted Juliana, who was on a break in the back office, and told her what happened. She came out and we both checked the waiting room again. Nothing. She said the bell was old and sometimes the mechanism stuck, then released randomly. It was a reasonable explanation and I wanted to believe it, but it happened again the next night. Same bell chimed, same empty waiting room. This time Juliana was with me when it happened. We both heard it clearly and we both walked out to find nothing. Juliana stared at the door for a long time, then said, "Okay, that's new." After that, the bell chimed at least once every shift, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always when we weren't in the waiting room. We started joking about it, calling it our ghost patient, but the jokes felt forced, like we were trying to convince ourselves it wasn't bothering us. About a week later, I was cleaning one of the exam rooms around 3 a.m. when I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, shuffling steps, like someone in socks. I assumed it was Juliana, so I called out to her. The footsteps stopped, no response. I walked to the doorway and looked down the hall. It was empty and the motion sensor lights were on, which meant something had triggered them recently. I called Juliana's name again, louder this time. She answered from the back office, asking what I needed. She hadn't left the office. I told her what I heard and she came out to the hallway. We stood there together, listening. The building was completely silent. Juliana looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for her. She said, "Maybe we should keep the doors to the exam rooms closed at night." We started doing that, but it didn't help. The footsteps continued. Some nights they'd walk the length of the hallway and stop at the break room door. Other nights they'd pace back and forth between the exam rooms. We never saw anyone, but the motion sensor lights would track the movement, flickering on one by one as whatever was moved through the building. The worst night was about 2 weeks before I quit. I was sitting in the break room, and Juliana was in the back office doing paperwork. Around 3:30, I heard the bell chime. I got up to check, and as I walked into the waiting room, I saw someone sitting in one of the chairs. A woman, her back to me, long hair hanging down past her shoulders. She was wearing a pale dress or gown, and she was completely still. I froze. My first thought was that I hadn't heard her come in, which didn't make sense because the bell had just rung. I said, "Can I help you?" My voice came out shaky. The woman didn't move, didn't turn around. I took a step closer and said it again, louder, "Nothing." And then she started to stand slowly, her movements wrong, somehow too smooth, like she was being lifted. I backed up, my heart slamming in my chest, and I called for Juliana. The woman turned toward me and I saw her face. It was blank, Not blank like expressionless, blank like empty. No features, just smooth skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. I felt something cold wash over me, and I ran back to the break room. Juliana came out a second later, asking what was wrong. I dragged her to the waiting room, but it was empty. No woman, no sign anyone had been there. I was shaking, and Juliana sat me down and made me explain what I saw. She didn't say anything for a long time, then she admitted she'd seen something similar about 6 months earlier. A figure in the hallway, standing outside one of the exam rooms, facing the wall. She'd assumed it was a patient sleepwalking or confused, but when she approached, it vanished. We filed a report with our supervisor the next day, saying we didn't feel safe working nights alone. The supervisor was skeptical, but she agreed to assign someone else to cover overnight shifts while they looked into it. I never went back. Juliana lasted another month, but she eventually transferred to a clinic in Elkins. I heard later that the clinic had been built on the site of an old sanatorium, one of those places where they sent tuberculosis patients back in the early 1900s. Most of them didn't survive. I don't know if that's related, but I think about it sometimes. About that blank face turning toward me, about what it wanted. Story 5. I drove a delivery truck for a lumber company based out of Webster Springs, and my route took me all over the back roads of Webster and Nicholas counties. Most of my deliveries were to construction sites or rural properties where people were building cabins or sheds. I'd usually start my route around 6 p.m. and finish up by 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on how many stops I had. It was solitary work, which I liked. Just me, the truck, and the radio. One of my regular stops was a property about 12 miles outside of Camden Ongorley, owned by a man named Garrett Prine. He was building a cabin on a plot of land he'd inherited, and he'd order lumber every few weeks. The driveway up to his property was rough, barely more than a dirt path through dense forest, and it took about 10 minutes of careful driving to reach the clearing where he was working. Garrett was always polite, always had a thermos of coffee ready, and he'd help me unload the truck even though he didn't have to. I'd been making deliveries to Garrett's place for about 3 months when things started feeling off. It was subtle at first. One night, I pulled up to the clearing around 11 p.m., and Garrett wasn't there. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes he'd leave a note on the cabin's frame telling me to just unload and leave the lumber stacked under a tarp. But this time there was no note. The clearing was empty, the work lights he usually kept on were off, and the whole place felt abandoned. I unloaded anyway, but I kept glancing toward the tree line. It felt like something was watching me. The next delivery 2 weeks later, Garrett was there. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, and he didn't say much. When I asked if everything was all right, he just nodded and said he'd been working long hours. I helped him unload, and as I was getting ready to leave, he said, "You ever hear anything strange out here?" I asked what he meant. He hesitated, then said, "Voices, at night, like someone calling from the woods." I told him I hadn't, but I'd only been there during deliveries. He nodded slowly and said, "It's probably nothing, just the wind." But he didn't look convinced. The next delivery was scheduled for late October, around midnight. I drove up the dirt path, and as I got closer to the clearing, I noticed the work lights were on, which was a good sign. But when I pulled into the clearing, Garrett's truck wasn't there. The lights were on, the generator was running, but there was no sign of him. I got out and called his name. No response. I walked around the cabin, which was about halfway finished, framing and some siding up, but no roof yet. There were tools scattered on the ground, a hammer lying in the dirt, a tape measure unspooled across the plywood floor. It looked like he'd left in the middle of working. I tried calling his cell, but it went straight to voicemail. I figured he'd probably gone into town for supplies and left the lights on by accident. I unloaded the lumber, stacked it neatly, and was about to leave when I heard something from the woods. A voice, distant but clear, calling out. It sounded like Garrett shouting my name. I walked toward the tree line, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I called back, asking if he was all right. The voice called again, same tone, same words, but it didn't get any closer. It just hung there in the distance, repeating my name. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, a cold feeling settling in my gut. The voice sounded like Garrett, but something about it was wrong. The cadence was off, too flat, like someone imitating his voice without understanding how people actually talk. I backed away from the trees and got in my truck. As I was pulling out of the clearing, I saw something move in the shadows near the cabin. A shape, tall and hunched, standing just outside the reach of the work lights. He didn't move toward me, just stood there watching. I hit the gas and didn't look back. I tried calling Garrett the next day, but his phone was still off. I contacted my supervisor and told him I wasn't comfortable making deliveries to that property anymore. He asked why, and I gave some vague excuse about the road being too rough. He reassigned the route to another driver. About a week later, I ran into a sheriff's deputy at a gas station, and I asked if he knew anything about Garrett Prine. The deputy's expression changed, and he said they'd found Garrett's truck abandoned on a logging road about 5 miles from his property. No sign of Garrett, no indication of foul play, just the truck sitting there with the keys still in the ignition. They searched the area, but hadn't found anything. He'd been missing for almost 3 weeks. I didn't tell the deputy what I'd heard that night. I didn't think he'd believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I kept thinking about that voice calling my name from the woods, and about the shape standing near the cabin, watching me leave. They never found Garrett. The property sat abandoned for a few months, and eventually someone else bought it at auction. I heard they bulldozed the cabin frame and started over. I don't know if they experienced anything, and I don't deliver lumber anymore. I switched to daytime routes, regular hours, nothing out in the deep woods. It's quieter, safer, and I sleep better now. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I hear that voice in my memory, flat and wrong, calling my name from the darkness, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd walked into those trees. Story 6. I worked as a night security guard at a small museum in Lewisburg, the kind of place that held regional history exhibits and old photographs of coal miners and railroad workers. The building was a converted bank from the 1920s, solid brick with high ceilings and a basement vault that they'd turned into storage. My shift was midnight to 8 a.m., and my job was mostly to walk the floors every hour, check the doors and windows, and make sure nothing was disturbed. It was easy work, and the museum was only 3 rooms plus the basement, so each round took maybe 20 minutes. The woman who'd worked the shift before me lasted about 6 months before quitting. Her name was Shiloh, and when I asked her why she was leaving, she said the hours didn't work with her schedule anymore. But there was something in the way she said it, like she was relieved to be done. I didn't push. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd do my rounds, sit at the front desk between checks, and read or listen to podcasts. The museum was quiet in a comfortable way, the kind of silence that felt peaceful rather than oppressive. The exhibits included old mining equipment, photographs, some clothing and tools from the early 1900s. Nothing particularly valuable, just pieces of local history preserved behind glass. Around the end of my first month, I started noticing things out of place. Small things. A photograph that had been hanging straight would be crooked when I came back from my rounds. A display case that I'd checked at the start of my shift would be slightly ajar later. I figured it was the building settling or maybe the heating system causing vibrations. Old buildings did that. But then I started finding footprints. Not in dust, because I cleaned the floors at the start of every shift, but in the condensation that would form on the tile near the basement door. Small, bare footprints, like a child's. They'd appear sometime between my rounds, always near the basement door, and they'd fade before I could take a picture. I mentioned it to the museum director, a woman named Pearl, and she said it was probably just moisture from the HVAC system creating patterns. She didn't seem concerned. The footprints continued, and after a while, I started to notice a pattern. They always appeared between 2 and 3 a.m., and they always led toward the basement door. One night, I decided to wait near the door to see if I could catch whatever was causing it. I turned off the lights in that section of the museum and sat in the dark, watching the tile floor. At 2:30, I saw condensation begin to form on the tile. Slowly, like someone breathing on glass, small patches of moisture appeared, and then the footprints formed, one step at a time, moving toward the basement door. I watched them materialize, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one there. Just the footprints appearing out of nothing, walking across the floor. I turned on the lights and the footprints stopped forming. The moisture was still there, but it stopped advancing. I unlocked the basement door, my hands shaking, and looked down the stairs. The basement was dark, and the air smelled stale and cold. I didn't go down. The next night, I heard something from the basement. A soft tapping sound, like knuckles on metal. It would come in bursts, tap, 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 then stop for a minute, then start again. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening, trying to convince myself it was the pipes or the heating system. but the tapping had a rhythm to it, almost like Morse code. I closed the basement door and locked it. Pearl called me the next morning and asked if I'd been in the basement during my shift. I said no. Why? She said one of the storage boxes had been opened, and some old photographs were scattered on the floor. I told her the basement door had been locked all night, and I hadn't heard anyone down there except for the tapping. She went quiet for a moment, then said she'd look into it. That night, I brought a flashlight and forced myself to go down to the basement. The vault was at the far end, a heavy steel door that was always kept locked. The storage area was just rows of metal shelving holding boxes of archived materials. I walked slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and I checked each row. Everything seemed normal until I reached the last shelf. There was a box on the floor, its contents spilled out. Old photographs, mostly of children from a school that had closed in the 1950s. They were black and white, formal portraits, kids in old-fashioned clothes staring stiffly at the camera. One of the photographs was lying face up, and I picked it up to get a better look. It showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of a brick building. She was barefoot. I felt a chill run through me, and I set the photograph back in the box. As I was leaving the basement, I heard a child's voice. It was faint, like it was coming from the vault, and it said, "Don't leave." I froze on the stairs, my heart pounding. The voice repeated, "Don't leave," and I ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut. I called Pearl and told her I was quitting. She tried to convince me to stay, said she'd look into the basement issue, but I was done. I finished my shift and left the keys on the front desk. As I was walking out, I glanced back at the basement door. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading from the door to where I'd been standing. I never went back to that museum. I heard later that they'd closed the basement to staff and visitors, said it was a safety hazard. Pearl never told me what she found down there, if anything, but I think about it sometimes. About that voice asking me not to leave, and about the barefoot girl in the photograph. About what might still be down there, waiting. Story 7. I worked as a night stalker at a small grocery store on the outskirts of Somersville. The store was independently owned, one of those places that stayed open 24 hours mostly out of habit rather than necessity. Between midnight and 6 a.m., we'd get maybe a handful of customers, usually truckers passing through or someone from the hospital needing supplies. My job was to unload deliveries, stock shelves, and keep the place tidy. I worked alone most nights, which I preferred. The manager, a guy named Troy, would sometimes stop by around 4 a.m. to check on things, but otherwise it was just me and the fluorescent lights. The store was laid out in a simple grid, 4 aisles, a cooler section in the back, and a small office behind the register. There was a loading dock out back where the trucks would drop off pallets, and I'd spend most of my shift moving boxes from the dock to the shelves. It was repetitive work, but it paid decently, and I could listen to music while I worked. Around the start of my 3rd month, I began noticing that items on the shelves were being rearranged. I'd stock a section, turn around to grab more boxes, and when I came back, cans would be facing backward or boxes would be stacked incorrectly. At first, I thought I was misremembering how I'd arranged things. I'd been working long hours, and fatigue can mess with your perception. But it kept happening consistently every night. One night I decided to test it. I stocked a shelf with soup cans, all labels facing forward, and then I walked to the far end of the aisle and just watched. For about 5 minutes nothing happened. Then one of the cans slowly rotated, its label turning toward the back of the shelf. I watched it move, a gradual rotation like someone was gently twisting it. My stomach dropped, and I walked over to check. The can was cold to the touch, colder than the others around it. I told Troy about it the next day and he laughed it off. He said the shelves weren't level, things probably just shifted over time, but I knew what I'd seen, that can had moved deliberately. After that, I started noticing other things. The lights in aisle 3 would flicker whenever I walked down it, even though the bulbs were new. The cooler door in the back would sometimes swing open on its own, the hydraulic hinge making a soft hiss as it moved. And I'd hear footsteps, faint but distinct, coming from the other side of the store. I'd go to check and there'd be no one there. The worst part was the office. The door to the office was behind the register, and it was supposed to stay closed during the night shift. But I'd find it open, the interior dark and still, like someone had just stepped inside. I started locking it at the beginning of every shift, but the lock wouldn't hold. I'd come back an hour later, and the door would be ajar. One night around 3 a.m., I was stocking the cooler when I heard the office door creak open. I turned around and I saw someone standing in the doorway, a man silhouetted against the light from the register area just standing there. I called out, asking if I could help him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there perfectly still. I walked toward the front of the store, my heart pounding, and as I got closer, the figure stepped back into the office. I reached the doorway and looked inside. The office was empty, just the desk and the filing cabinet and the chair, everything exactly as it should be. But the air felt wrong, heavy and cold, like I'd walked into a freezer. I backed out and closed the door, locking it again even though I knew it wouldn't stay locked. I finished my shift as quickly as I could, avoiding the office, and when Troy came by at 4, I told him what I'd seen. He didn't laugh this time. He just looked at the office door and said, "Yeah, we've had some issues with that room." He didn't elaborate and I didn't ask, but the next night I found out what he meant. I was stocking shelves around 1 a.m. when I heard a crash from the office. I ran to the front and the office door was wide open. Inside, the filing cabinet had been tipped over, papers scattered across the floor. The desk chair was overturned and the light was swinging from the ceiling, casting wild shadows on the walls. I didn't go inside. I just stood in the doorway staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound like someone exhaling heavily. It came from inside the office, from the corner where the shadows were deepest. I felt every muscle in my body lock up, and I took a step back. The sound came again, louder, and I saw movement in the shadows. Something shifting, pulling itself upright. I ran. I didn't stop to lock up, didn't even grab my jacket. I just got in my car and drove home. I called Troy the next morning and told him I quit. He tried to convince me to come back, said he'd explain everything, but I didn't want to hear it. I was done. A week later, I ran into one of the other stockers at a gas station. His name was Omar, and he'd worked nights at the store before me. I asked him why he'd left, and he gave me this look, like he'd been waiting for me to ask. He said, "You saw it, didn't you? The thing in the office." I nodded. He told me the store used to be a funeral home back in the 60s. The office was where they'd kept the bodies before embalming. Omar said he'd seen the same figure I had, standing in the doorway, watching. He'd quit after it followed him out to the loading dock one night. I never went back to that store. I heard later that they'd closed it down, said it wasn't profitable anymore. But I think about it sometimes, about that sound, and about the movement in the shadows. About what might still be in that office, waiting for the next person to work the night shift. Story 8. My last job before I moved out of West Virginia was working security at a small industrial park outside of Sutton. The park had maybe 6 or 7 businesses, mostly warehouses and light manufacturing, and they shared a night security guard to keep an eye on things. My shift was 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and my job was to drive a circuit around the park every hour, check the locks on the buildings, and watch for anything unusual. It was quiet work, the kind of job where nothing ever happens, and that's exactly how you want it. The industrial park was at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by forest on 3 sides. During the day, you'd see trucks coming and going, workers loading and unloading, the normal hum of activity. At night, it was deserted, just me and the empty parking lots and the distant sound of the highway. Most of the buildings were standard metal warehouses, but there was one at the far end of the park that was different. It was older brick construction, with narrow windows and a flat roof. The sign above the door said it used to be a textile mill, but it had been converted into storage space for one of the companies. I didn't have a key to that building, and I wasn't supposed to go inside, just check the exterior and make sure the doors were secure. During my first week, I noticed that the building's doors were always slightly warm to the touch, even on cold nights. I mentioned it to my supervisor, a guy named Dennis, and he said the building had old heating pipes that ran through the walls. They probably weren't insulated properly, so the heat bled through, made sense. But then I started seeing lights inside. Not bright lights, just faint glows that would appear in the windows on the 2nd floor. They'd flicker on for a few seconds, then go dark. I'd shine my flashlight up, but I couldn't see anything through the grimy glass. I checked the doors every night, and they were always locked, no signs of forced entry. One night, I was doing my rounds around 2 a.m. when I heard music coming from inside the building. It was faint, muffled by the walls, but I could make out the tune. It sounded like old jazz, the kind of scratchy recording you'd hear on a vintage radio. I walked around the building, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the second floor, near the back. I called Dennis and told him what I was hearing. He sounded annoyed, said I should check with the company that rented the building to see if someone was working late. But it was 2 in the morning and the parking lot was empty. No one was working late. The music continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The next night, I brought a ladder from my truck and climbed up to one of the second floor windows. The glass was covered in grime, but I wiped a section clean and looked inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out rows of old machinery, rusted and covered in dust. There was no sign of anyone inside, no equipment that could have been playing music. As I was climbing down the ladder, I heard footsteps inside the building. They were on the second floor, walking back and forth, the floorboards creaking under the weight. I stood at the base of the ladder, listening, and the footsteps stopped directly above where I was standing. I waited, barely breathing, and then I heard a tapping sound. Someone was tapping on the glass from the inside. I looked up, and I saw a shadow in the window I'd just cleaned. A figure standing right there, tapping on the glass with one finger. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate. I backed away from the building, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and the shadow moved. It pressed against the glass, and I could see the outline of a face. No features, just the shape of a head and shoulders watching me. I got in my truck and drove to the front of the park. I didn't do any more rounds that night. I just sat in my truck until 6 a.m. waiting for my shift to end. When Dennis arrived in the morning, I told him what happened. He didn't believe me. He said I was probably seeing reflections or shadows from passing cars, but I knew what I'd seen. I agreed to work one more night just to finish out the week, but I told Dennis I wasn't going near that building. He said fine, just check the other buildings and leave that one alone. So that's what I did. I drove my circuit, avoided the old mill, and tried to ignore the fact that every time I looked in that direction, I could see lights flickering in the second floor windows. Around 4 a.m., my truck's radio started acting up. It would switch stations on its own, cycling through static and snippets of music and voices. I tried turning it off, but it wouldn't respond. And then it stopped on a station, and I heard a voice. It was faint, distorted by static, but it sounded like someone calling for help. I turned up the volume, and the voice repeated, "Help me, please help me." I turned the radio off manually, pulling the power cord, and the voice stopped. I sat there in the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and I looked toward the old mill. Every window on the second floor was lit up, bright and harsh, and I could see shapes moving inside. Multiple figures walking back and forth like they were looking for something. I started the truck and left. Didn't wait for 6 a.m., didn't call Dennis. I just drove out of the industrial park and didn't look back. I quit the next day, told Dennis I'd found another job. He didn't seem surprised. A few months later, I heard they'd torn down the old mill. Said the building was structurally unsound, a safety hazard. I don't know if that's true, but I'm glad it's gone. I still think about those figures in the windows and about the voice on the radio asking for help, about what might have been trapped in that building, and about how close I came to finding out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit the like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.